The quiet of the late afternoon was a fragile thing, like glass poised to shatter. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees lining the street, a gentle whisper that carried none of the tension simmering inside the house. 4872 Pinecrest Drive, with its tidy lawn and carefully painted shutters, looked serene from the outside. But inside, the air was thick, dense with the weight of unspoken truths and impending consequences. Sarah stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes darting toward the clock on the wall. Each tick felt like a pulse in her chest, pushing her closer to something she wasn't ready to face. Her hands twisted nervously in front of her, the gold band on her finger catching the fading sunlight streaming through the blinds. She turned the ring absently, feeling its familiar weight, but its meaning had changed, warped by choices she couldn't undo. The sound of a car door slamming outside jolted her, her breath catching. She froze, listening. Heavy, measured footsteps crunched against the gravel of the driveway, moving toward the front door with an inevitability she couldn't escape. She knew the rhythm. 3 deliberate knocks, a pause, then 2 more, quick and final. A rhythm she'd heard countless times before. The sound of Jack coming home. Not today, not now. He wasn't supposed to be here. He couldn't be here. The door opened, and there he was. Jack stepped over the threshold, dressed in his uniform, his boots scuffed and dusty from the road. He looked as he always did when returning home from deployment, worn but steady, his shoulders squared, his movements purposeful. The duffel bag hung from his shoulder, his presence filling the space like a force of nature. "Surprise," he said, offering her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sarah felt the world tilt under her feet. "Jack." The word barely left her lips. "I thought I'd surprise you," he continued, dropping his bag near the door with a thud. "Early leave. We wrapped up the assignment ahead of schedule." Sarah tried to keep her expression neutral, to force her voice into calmness. "That's great. I just wasn't expecting you." Jack's eyes scanned her face, lingering a moment too long. "Yeah, I gathered that." Silence stretched between them, too heavy to fill. Jack finally glanced away, his gaze sweeping the room. Something flickered in his expression, an almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes, as if he noticed that something was out of place. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She couldn't tell what it was, maybe the absence of her usual calm demeanor, maybe a detail she hadn't accounted for. His gaze settled on the staircase, and she saw it, the change in him. His stance stiffened, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might say something, confront her outright. Instead, he turned back to her. "Who's here?" The question landed like a blow. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. "What?" Jack stepped closer, his eyes sharp now, cold and assessing. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I heard someone upstairs." "There's no one here," she insisted too quickly, the words tripping over each other. "You're imagining things. You've been on the road. You're tired." Jack's jaw tightened. "Don't do this." His voice was low, dangerous in its calmness. "Just tell me the truth." Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came. She saw the shift in Jack then, a man trained to see through deception, to anticipate danger, to read the room before it exploded. He didn't need her to tell him anything. He already knew. He moved past her, his boots echoing against the hardwood floor. "Jack, wait!" she called, her voice breaking. She grabbed for his arm, but he pulled free with a practiced ease. Jack took the stairs 2 at a time, his movements swift and deliberate. Sarah followed, panic bubbling up in her chest. Her mind raced with desperate explanations, excuses, anything that might stop what was happening. But she knew it was too late. He reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the guest room. The door was ajar, the faint shuffle of movement inside confirming what Jack already suspected. His hand hovered over the doorknob for half a beat, as if steeling himself for what he was about to find. Then he pushed it open. The room was small and plain. A bed, a nightstand, a lamp. And standing next to the unmade bed was Riker. He looked caught, frozen mid-movement as if trying to decide whether to speak or bolt. He was dressed casually, jeans, a wrinkled shirt, and yet, In this moment, he might as well have been wearing a target on his chest. Jack stared at him, his expression a mask of disbelief and barely restrained fury. "You've got to be kidding me," Jack said, his voice low and cold. Riker opened his mouth to speak, raising his hand slightly. "Look, man." "Don't," Jack cut in sharply. "Don't talk. Don't say a word." Sarah stumbled into the room behind Jack, her voice trembling. "Jack, please, let me explain." Jack turned, his gaze locking onto her with such intensity that it felt like a physical weight. "Explain? What's there to explain, Sarah? That while I was gone, while I was out there risking everything, you brought him into my house? Into our house?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but her words failed her. She had rehearsed 1,000 things she might say if the truth ever came out, but none of them felt right. None of them mattered now. Jack turned back to Riker, his jaw clenching. "Get out!" Riker hesitated. I said, get out." Jack's voice was louder this time, the authority in it leaving no room for argument. Riker glanced at Sarah, his face torn between shame and fear. "I'm sorry," he muttered, then grabbed his bag from the floor and moved past Jack. His footsteps echoed down the stairs, and a moment later, the front door opened and slammed shut. Silence followed, thick and unbearable. Jack turned back to Sarah, his expression unreadable now, somewhere between anger and something deeper, something more painful. He looked at her as if trying to reconcile the woman he knew with the one standing in front of him. "How long?" Sarah wiped at her face, her hands shaking. "Jack, how long?" he demanded, his voice shaking with the effort to hold himself together. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "A couple of months." Jack's eyes closed for a moment, his hands flexing at his sides. "A couple of months," he repeated, as if trying to make sense of it. "I trusted you. I trusted us. I thought we were stronger than this." "I didn't mean for it to happen," Sarah said, her words tumbling out in desperation. "I was lonely, Jack. You were gone for so long, and it felt like you weren't coming back. I needed something." "Something," Jack repeated, his voice sharp. "You needed something? So you betrayed me? Betrayed us?" The words cut through her like a blade. "I'm sorry," she choked. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this," Jack shot back, his voice breaking. "Sorry doesn't erase the fact that I came home early, excited to see you, and instead I walked into this." He turned away from her, his hands raking through his hair. "God, Sarah." Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed, her sobs racking her body. She wanted to say more, to beg for forgiveness, to somehow make him understand how it had come to this. But she knew it was useless. Jack was a man who lived by honor, by loyalty. The line she had crossed was one he could never ignore, never forgive. Minutes passed in suffocating silence. Jack finally turned back to her, his voice quiet, resigned. "I'm leaving tonight. I'll come back tomorrow for my things." "Jack, please," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "Don't go. Don't leave like this." He shook his head. "I can't stay here, Sarah. I can't even look at you right now." She didn't try to stop him this time. She watched as he grabbed his duffel bag from the front hall and pulled open the door. The setting sun bathed the street in a warm glow, a cruel contrast to the devastation inside the house. Jack paused, one hand on the door frame, his back to her. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice low. "I loved you. I would have done anything for you." Then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the hollow silence of the house. Sarah sank onto the stairs, her head in her hands, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like a vice. The life she had built, the life she had taken for granted, had shattered in a single afternoon. Hours passed, though she barely noticed. Darkness settled over the house, the quiet now unbearable. She moved numbly through the rooms, packing Jack's belongings into neat piles. His shirts, his boots, his medals. Each item held a memory, a fragment of the life they'd shared. She paused at the dresser, her gaze falling on a small photo tucked into the corner of the mirror. It was from their wedding day, Jack in his dress blues, smiling at her with such pure, unguarded love. Her reflection stared back at her now, a stranger in her own skin. By morning, the house was still. Jack returned as he said he would, his steps quiet as he moved through the rooms collecting his things. He didn't speak to her, didn't look at her, and she didn't try to stop him. When he finally left, the emptiness he left behind was overwhelming. On the kitchen counter, she placed an envelope with her wedding ring inside. A note lay beneath it, her words careful and deliberate. Jack, you deserve better. You deserve someone who understands what it means to love and be loyal, even when it's hard. I failed you and I can't take that back. I won't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that you were never the problem. I was. I hope someday you find the happiness and love you deserve. Sarah Jack stood in the driveway, the morning sun spilling over him as he tucked the envelope into his bag. He glanced back at the house one last time, his heart heavy with grief. He had loved her, he had trusted her, and now all he could do was move forward, one step, one breath, one day at a time, because that's what survivors do.